Hello, everyone. Welcome to our April webinar. As you might have noticed, we're a week early because next week is a holiday. Historically, the 27th of April is Maris Modi's Day due to the fact that that's when that particular genus is flowering. But because of the City Nature Challenge next long weekend, I think we're just going to be falling straight into that. I'm Rupert Koopman, presenting this webinar on behalf of the Botanical Society, and thank you for making time to join us. Okay, so even though we did entitle this webinar Putting Indigenous Plants to Work, I would like to issue a big disclaimer right up front that things do not have to work in order to have value. And I think especially in the nature space, it's something we're always confronted with in terms of we must show the value, the ecosystem service, what are the plants doing for us? And yeah, that's not necessarily so. However, we do have our amazing plants which can be used. And it's taken a bit of time to get to this point, but our three panelists today are coincidentally women that are at the forefront of putting our plants to work and seeing how we can actually use indigenous plants in an applied way. So we're going to start right away. Marijke, if you could put your camera on and start sharing. So we're very, very honored to have Marijke Honig with us this evening. She is a botanist and landscaper of, as they say in Afrikaans, of van formaat, with a formidable track record and reputation. And she's been working at Kirstenbosch back in the day, but now is doing her own thing, and in many different interesting places. So Marijke, thank you so much. Just unmute yourself as well so we can hear you. And we're very keen to hear what you've got to say. Great.
Thanks so much, Rupert. Hello, and welcome everyone. And thank you so much for the opportunity. It's really great to be able to talk about something that I'm passionate about. And I'm going to dive straight in. And we'll be talking about how I've used various indigenous, what I call plant pellets in some of my projects. Oh, sorry, I just thought, hang on. How do I advance it?
Yeah.
Sorry about this.
So you just click on your side, no worries.
No, that doesn't seem to be working the way it normally does.
Try your arrows. Cool.
Yeah, sorry.
Got it.
And so I'm going to dive straight in because, I trained as a botanist, started landscaping, and I started making these lists, which I put into Excel because I find you have plants in different situations. For instance, some need, you need a shade palette, and then there were those plants or those areas that get sun and shade. So I'd make a list for that. Then there was a list for clay soil and another one for screening. And to this day, I find it very difficult when I'm standing in a garden and someone says, what can I plant here? I know that one has to, I'm quite sort of practical, so I feel like it needs to be functional, but I don't always have those 20, 25 species at the top of my head. And so this has just become an aid memoir for myself, really. And that grew into this book, which was published in 2014. And essentially, it describes a number of functional palettes, like plants for screening or for security, or sometimes in a situation like shade or sun and shade, or for the senses like fragrance or edible plants. There's a pond palette. And I thought I would just run through some of the projects that I've done looking at these various palettes. So the first project is the Biodiversity Showcase Garden in Greenpoint Park. This lies at the heart of the Greenpoint Park, which is actually a 50-hectare park. And I don't know, can you see my arrow? It's this sort of boot shape.
Sorry,
yeah.
Two things. I see your arrow, but there's a little bit of lag, so maybe put your camera off, and that'll just help your bandwidth in terms of.
Yes, I'll do that now.
Thank you.
Thanks. There. Thanks, Rupert. So it's at the heart of the Greenpoint Park, and OVP and Associates did the design for the whole park, as well as the biodiversity garden, but I was involved in the planting. And it was a project that was sort of, it went to a big crescendo in 2010. We were trying to get ready for the World Cup, didn't quite make it. But this is essentially what the site looked like in, before planting. And so I was asked for a conceptual design and to develop a series of thematic gardens for the biodiversity garden, which would highlight this incredible biodiversity that we have in the Cape. And what I realized is that because it was a park and this was so open and people would be playing ball and picnicking, I wanted to screen the display areas so that I could focus people's attention on all the educational stuff. And so for that, I used a palette called Coastal Thicket, which has proven to be very hardy and successful. It's a mix of the usual stuff you find at the coast, beto and blombos and milkwoods and so on. And this served a number of functions. It helped to create shelter from the wind, so sort of wind breaks. But as I said, it was also a screening element to focus people's attention on the displays. And it also gave a bit of a neutral backdrop to the displays. So in this image, for instance, these colorful plants in the front, which are lower, that's the display. This is just as you walk in. And then behind the Tocananthus and the other plants is that Coastal Thicket palette. And similarly here, you'll see that the Coastal Thicket is sort of framing that lawn area where the theme there is that everything is connected. And it's a sort of an educational display. It's just one of the few sort of before and after pictures just after planting in September 2010. Some of the other palettes that we used were climbers. So for example, in the middle of the garden, I wanted to have a dome with climbers on it, which would sort of echo the koi display, which was a bit further on. And this is what it looked like at the time of planting. And I just want to point out that we used mesh to cover it, which I think is a brilliant support for climbers, far better than what a lot of other things that people try. And lo and behold, 5 years later, it was nicely covered. And I used a variety of climbers, coastal climbers, Dipodum lignosus and Rocissus, but the Rocissus was definitely the winner. And it's proven to be, it was a little bit slower, but it's been the most long-lived and sort of reliable. And I also wanted to just show how the design of the climber supports, how important that is. So these pergolas have never really been covered with plants, even 13 years after they were put up, because they never had these ladders. And the climbers don't really grow from one bar to another. These tendril climbers need much more support than that. In fact, I've learned that even we give them little ladders. So this is a garden we planted up recently, and I was delighted to see that the guys had made these little ladders to get them onto the fence, because tendril climbers, they like to hang on to things. And in fact, they grow a lot faster if they can. Then further along in the biodiversity garden are a series of demonstration gardens, where one, in a sense, can also see different palettes at work. There's a hedging display. Hedges are useful for a number of reasons. And so here, this was just after planting on the top left. And you'll see that we tried, or maybe you can't see, but I know that it's Salvia africana lutea, which actually hedges beautifully, but it didn't make it because it gets quite wet there. It's quite waterlogged in winter. But you'll see the image on the right, that's Grevia robusta, actually. It's a bit of it unusually. And then there's Collinema. Anyway, we had a number of different hedges, just to show that you can clip plants as well. They can look neat and tidy if you like. There's also a display focusing on sunbirds, plants that attract sunbirds. A lot of them happen to be red and orange, so it's very colorful. Then there's gardening for wildlife, which I almost say, it always makes me smile, because I think all plants attract wildlife. I don't think there's one that doesn't. But in the biodiversity garden, we focus particularly on natural pest control. And just to highlight that, things like ladybirds and chameleons and whatever you all help to control natural pests. They're the predators of pests. And the importance of not spraying and so on. Then another palette that's been that I've used is just in general is foliage. I think people tend to initially be attracted very much to flowers and color, and when you go to the garden center, that's what one sort of goes for. But actually, foliage is what's there year round. And so, for example, here you can see the red leucodendron blush. It's got a fantastic color, and combined with the little fine leaves of Phylica ericoides and the gray of Octotus. And even this very simple planting of Pelargonium cuculatum, those larger leaves combined with the gray of the Euryops and then that dark Diospyros behind is quite effective. So I think it's useful to remember foliage, color, and texture as a design element. Then in the biodiversity garden, we also have a sort of felt course display, all the edible plants, and Loubie obviously is going to go into a lot of detail there, but I just wanted to point out there is a small section called the Felt Supermarket, showing some of the plants that the Khoi used in the early days and which are still in use today. And then something not in the book, but in the biodiversity garden is the felt types display. It's very stylized. Basically, you can see here that orange band is supposed to be renosterfelt plants, and then the sandy band is strandfelt, and then there's lowland famous and mountain famous. Very stylized, because we actually have 23 different vegetation types in Greater Cape Town. So obviously we couldn't go into that amount of detail. And those plants aren't actually commercially available. But even so, it gives you an idea of the flavor of the different felt types that we have, or the dominant ones. Then, of course, there's the pond palette. So there are some big ponds in the park, and we put in water lilies and all the marginal plants that you expect to see in a pond. There's a wetland area, which we also planted up with not necessarily Cape wetland, but plants that are associated with water. And this is what it looks like now. Interestingly, quite a high maintenance part of the garden. I don't know why, but the grasses and the weeds just seem to come up quite more easily than in other parts of the displays. So just briefly, I had the good fortune actually of being involved in the garden in the maintenance they asked me to come and sort of consult every 2 or 3 months and give them some direction in what to do. And I did a bit of training of staff, and which was fantastic because I really got to learn to see how the garden grew and evolved and what worked and what didn't. We also went through the big drought. So that was a big learning curve, and had plenty of irrigation failures as well. And the whole of biodiversity really works. Having a lot of different species definitely adds to the resilience of a landscape. And so from that point of view, it's an excellent thing to do. On the other hand, having mixed plantings requires plant knowledge, which not everyone has. And so, for example, this image on the left is this lovely fambos grass called, I think it's called Pseudopentamyrus. And it was weeded out because the staff member thought it, was just a weed, and didn't know that Gail from Good Hope Nursery had carefully grown it for the display. So, and that's just one small example. But in general, I would say that mixed plantings do require more maintenance, but they look great. The image on the right is a sort of a little cameo of what I call mountain fambos. And then during the drought, we did have quite a lot of species loss because of the way that we'd watered plants during establishment. We'd actually made these perfectly water-wise plants water dependent because they were being watered 3 times a week. And we used spray irrigation like everyone does. You're actually just wetting the very top layer of the soil, which encourages the roots to stay very shallow. So when they suddenly don't get the water, then they died. Even tough species like Allegia tictorum, common small little decrete that you see growing on, unirrigated verges, died. And when I saw that, I thought, what's going on? And then I realized we'd actually made these plants water dependent. So it's very important that you water correctly and not too often. That you water deeply and infrequently during the establishment period. And the other thing I realized is that self-seeding species, which people often call weeds, are actually a big bonus because they are the ones that filled up the spaces when things died during the drought. So we really learned to embrace those self-seeding ones. And also plants grown from seed are actually more genetically diverse than those grown from cuttings. So if something like geranium incarnum, which self-seeds and keeps popping up, you'll find it becomes more and more adapted to your site. So again, from that point of view, we really need to embrace those plants that grow from seed. And then 10 years after it was planted, we did a survey. I asked some friends to help, and Rupert kindly also came, and a couple of other planty people. And we walked around, when we recorded how many plants were there. I'd planted about over 300 species, and then quite a few of them had to be replaced and often died again, which tells you something. But so in 10 years on, we had more or less 200 species. We couldn't identify all the grasses in the sedges because they're quite tricky. But I would say about 2/3 of the plants were still there, which is pretty good going, actually, I think. Although, I mean, some of you might think, well, they're losing 1/3 of the species is terrible. But one has to realize that quite a lot of species are short-lived. We also had included a lot of bulbs, which became overgrown. If they're not open, they can't survive. And the soil wasn't ideal for mountain fame-boss because it was actually quite waterlogged. It's kind of wants to be a wetland, really, at Greenpoint. So there were a number of factors that contributed to that. And overall, I was astonished at how many had worked. Moving on from the biodiversity garden, I'm just also going to show just a few other gardens or other landscapes. So there is a chapter in my book on what I called grassy effects, because I didn't want to call it grasses because it includes restios, which of course technically are not grasses at all. And this is a palette that I used, I think, quite successfully at the Constantia Oatsig Bike Park. It's a very simple planting. It's just got mainly Aristida jansiformis, used a little bit of other grasses, and then mainly restios. And it's really withstood the test of time, and also, again, lack of watering at times, and fair amount of abuse from bikers or children just running through the planting or whatever. So, but we really haven't scratched the surface of the grasses in South Africa. I checked with Rupert just now. Apparently we have over 950 species, and we have just a handful in the Cape anyway. Obviously very different up in Gauteng, but in the Cape we have so few that are commercially available. And I really look forward to more of these grasses becoming available and being used in landscapes. Then, of course, there's a palette which I call screening. That's a very functional palette. Just practically every garden or landscape needs some aspect of screening. And this garden that we did in Camps Bay was no exception. The owners wanted to just see the sea and not a single roof or neighbor. And so we brought in crane trees, and a lot of Syzygium ghanense were planted like soldiers along the boundaries of the property. And we also brought in some feature trees. So feature trees would be trees that are, have amazing flowers or just incredible architecture. And we brought in coral tree and also some Scotia, Brachypetala. But what I wanted to just, a word of caution, is that these mature trees they're like giant pot plants, and they actually require drip irrigation and dedicated aftercare. So it's not, if you can grow something from small, I always would do that. It's just sometimes people don't want to wait. Then there's a palette in my book called Cottage Style, one that I've hardly ever used. I'm not someone who does a lot with flowers, and mostly herbaceous plants need quite a bit of water. And I mostly am operating or trying to use less water or in unirrigated landscapes. So I can't, it's not, as I said, not a palette I use often. But not too long ago, I had the opportunity to do what I call a color garden at a property in Constantia. And I must say it was a lot of fun. I am inspired by Piet Adolf, but try to do a sort of local or my own version of that. And wow, it really is pretty colorful. I didn't use exclusively indigenous plants, but it really is predominantly indigenous, about 70%, I would say, and shows that you can do that with the grasses and get that sort of effect. So on the image on the left, for instance, I just want to point out Nemesia fruticans, which is such a dainty looking thing, but so incredibly tough. And I think I saw it when I was paddling along the Doring River in a very arid landscape, which would explain why it's so tough. But it looks, I think, like a little cottage garden plant. Then the aloe tenua gives lovely color. I used Osteospermum imbricatum, Euryops, Brotenifolius. Admittedly, these very bright colors is an exotic salvia, but also used grasses like Melanus noviglumus and Aristida. Anyway, it was a lot of fun just to do that for a change. And then the last project that I'm going to talk about is one that we're still busy with, but it's coming to an end. It's called the Mountain View Development in Mossel Bay. This is a low-cost housing development where there are 1,000 housing units that were built. and outside Mossel, or just on the sort of ridge of Mossel Bay, so quite a coastal environment. It's a long, narrow property. It's about 700, almost a kilometer long, 3/4 of a kilometer long. So, that gives you an idea of the scale. And you can see even from this landscape plan how densely, how dense the housing development is and how little actually space there was for greening. But, and when we first visited, I was quite taken aback, actually. There was just so much paving and so much tarred roads and paved roads and so on. And these services have to work very hard because people have cars, they need to park everywhere. There wasn't enough parking. So it was very challenging. One of the environmental management plan requirements was that 500 trees had to be planted, which I thought fantastic, let's choose where we want to plant them. But actually, in the end, it wasn't where do we want to plant, but where can we plant? And the reason why is that this is just a small part of the landscape plan, but you can just see how little green there is. And on the south side, there was a power line and with a 10-meter servitude, not allowed to plant a single tree under a power line on 10 meters on either side of it. So that excluded the entire one side of the development. And then you'll see these brown lines are all the sewer lines, and then there's also water, of course. So there's a spider network of underground services. And then the other thing is that these houses, to create the housing platforms, they put in like 0.5 meter of G5 compacted. And even when we removed that, there was just no percolation. In other words, the soil just did not drain at all. So when you put all those factors together, it becomes an extremely challenging place for trees. And then it's windy and coastal, and then we also had the shading of the buildings to deal with. So we thought that raised plant was probably the way to go, also just to protect these trees from cars and just to lift them off the ground, but also to deal a little bit with the drainage. And we created these sort of curved planters out of concrete segments, and the idea being that people can also sort of sit on them, so they become these public spaces where people can hang out. And yeah, so far so good. So we put them wherever we could with respect to the underground services. And I did a lot of research, look at root systems of trees, and luckily Rand Water had brought out a booklet, because of course I don't know. I was surprised to see that wild olive is considered to have a very aggressive root system. One of the more successful tree planters that we did was this one, which was a long linear one where we had a slotted curve, and so the paved area drains into the planter. And that really has been a win, because all these trees are being watered by hand. We couldn't afford an irrigation system, and it probably would have been vandalized. In fact, it definitely would have been vandalized. And I also believe that now with this hand watering, which is done once a week, that we are achieving this deep, infrequent watering, which is good for establishment of plants. But of course, it's expensive. So if we can do any kind of passive watering and infiltration of water, that's the way to go. I wish we could have done more of this, but it was actually quite difficult, again, because the percolation rates are so low on the site. I'm nearing the end, because I might be running over time, but just to say the one other challenge was this, that you have these very wide ranging conditions from full sun to full shade because of the shading of the building. And so fortunately, the local landscaper, Lucretia van der Walt, is brilliant, because she would phone me and say, look, I don't think this is going to work here. It's not sunny enough. So what should we do instead? Or she would make a suggestion. And I had accommodated it to some degree, with the plant list, but it really, really helped to have her expertise and be able to be flexible on site. So things like Pelargonium peltatum, Plectranthus madagascariensis are very handy in those sort of situations. So that's the palette that I call sun and shade. And then, of course, one of our favorite palettes, of course, is Fynbos. And we did use some on the site. I tend to keep away from Fynbos because I find it's not long-lived enough and a bit finicky. But I saw that on site, with the Stacha was growing, the Wilde Dacha, as well as Nidia sclerosa was doing really well, and Dickriet. So we planted those, and they're no surprise, they've done really well. We used climbers quite a bit because there just wasn't space for trees. So we rather trying to get the climbers up onto overhead cables. But by and large, I would say the planting has really done very well so far. and long may it last. And then there are also some little community parks, and we put in lots of medicinal plants, as many as I could, that I thought people would be able to use, and we planted some vegetables and so on. Been very interesting to see that these spaces are tricky spaces because of the different people that use them, and I won't go into that now. It's all about a plant palette. Just to say, also in these parks, I used a lot of fragrant plants like the lemon pelargonium and the rose pelargonium, because I just think they're delightful, and many of them are tough. And finally, sorry, the one image is on top of the other. I just wanted to say I enjoy writing books about and thinking about resilience, and there are some articles in Pro Landscaper. They're online, so you can Google them there. And I have an Instagram account if you want to see it. Try to do sort of vaguely educational posts. And finally, if you are interested in the book, then you can contact me, or they're available in bookstores. Yeah, and if you have any questions, let me know.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Marijke. So our general way of doing it is that we run through the speakers first, and then we do the Q&A at the end. Cool. So go and have a breather.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Rupert.
Cool. We're gonna swap the presentations around a bit. Sorry, Rirhandzu, because Loubie's battery is running low. So Loubie, do I need to share the presentation from my side? You can put on your camera and speak on your side.
Rupert, we're going to try just to see whether we can actually get it to share.
Okay, cool.
Last time, and I'm not sure we will be able to. Okay, let's see if that's no. Okay, no, it's not. It's working. So I'm going to be telling you next.
Remote controlling me.
Yes.
that's fine. Okay, so just by means of introduction, this is Loubie Rusch, who is what shall we call you, an indigenous food plant technician and author.
That's a new one.
Like a let's go with that. You can trademark it. And essentially has been looking at our local plants from a culinary point of view, and specifically or what would you say, like 90% of it in the winter rainfall areas, but there are also some summer rainfall species that slip into the frying pan. So, okay, so let me just share on this side. Oops. That's not full screen, is it?
No.
Okay, let's just try that again. I've done exactly what I told you not to do. I have too many windows open.
Well, maybe I'll just start chatting away anyway while you're doing that. So my background is actually that I studied architecture and then worked as a landscape designer, including actually for OVP. And then the other interesting thing is that Marijke, Rirhandzu, and I overlap. So Marijke and I have done projects together, and Rirhandzu and I are currently actually collaborating at the Sustainability Institute. So there's a kind of connection between these three women that you selected today. So I'm really focusing on the fact that we've kind of forgotten about our indigenous food plants. You can give us the next one. Next slide. So, I mean, this is really just, I'm sure many of the people in this webinar are aware of our winter rainfall area, and that the majority of South Africa is actually summer rainfall, and that the historically farmed landscapes tend to be in the summer rainfall areas, and the sort of farming traditional knowledge systems never existed in the Western Cape. So cultivating edibles from the Western Cape was never anything that existed, even though people pre-colonially here ate off our landscapes literally for millennia. You can give me the next slide. So really, since colonization, there has been pretty much a complete erasure of our foodways being the way in which we access and make use of our foods, whether it's by agriculture and whether it's our cultural food systems. You can give me the next one. And if you, this is close to Paternoster, where another person at Wolfgat that Rupert is very good friends with is working a lot with indigenous foods. And in the foreground here, we have a little patch where there is still some biodiversity. In the very far background, there is also some more biodiversity, but the bit in the middle is wheat fields, which is the kind of simplified mass production of food that we've ended up with progressively since colonization. You can give the next slide. And if you look at this foreground piece of ground, the photographs that I've got around the edges there are some of the food plants that you find in this kind of mixture of juicy, squidgy plants that are at the edge of these rather dead wheat fields by comparison. Next slide. And you know, what's also very interesting about them is that very pale sandy stuff in the background is the wheat field in the middle of summer in that same area. And we're peering through, in the driest of times, a slangbessie bush. And this was in the sort of day zero period where we weren't supposed to be irrigating at all. And yet here's a little slangbessie hanging in there where there's been complete crop failure of the plants that are being growing as food in our landscapes. Next slide. So, you know, one of the things that has happened is what I call food blindness. And in fact, this is actually a project that Marijke and I worked on together and at Village Heights, which is on the Cape Flats. And I did a bit of a sort of tasting thing with a local community that we're working with. And I brought in all sorts of delicious things for us. We did a bit of cooking together. And then I did a little stroll around. Within 3 or 4 minutes, I found all sorts of edibles growing right there next to an informal settlement where people are incredibly poor and hungry, and yet wild foods are growing there and they're not recognized and they're most certainly not made use of. Next slide. And then in this next one, this is actually at a small-scale garden in Khayelitsha, where the top right image shows that a very well-weeded, very sandy patch is where the foods are being grown, and the other images show what's going on outside of that fence, where Sandkool is, bottom left image, self-propagating itself with gay abandon and producing food and even competing with the wild grasses. And there you have wild food growing itself, where it's been weeded out of the section where what is perceived as food is being grown under great difficulty in the sort of very poor sand that many of the farmers struggle with on the Cape Flats. Next slide. And all of this is sort of alludes to a kind of food blindness that is one of the things that has been a lot about my food journey, is actually seeing how can we begin to really reconnect with the fact that our landscapes are edible and start making use of them. So I've been exploring, you can give me the next slide, wild foods for about the last 12 to 15 years. And the way in which I've categorized them is into 5 different categories. The first couple actually are the leafy greens and vegetables, which includes some of the sort of succulent ones, as well as the softer leafed ones, and then some of those like top middle picture, which is Sandkool, which is in fact the vegetable in the previous slide that was growing wild. And if it was actually allowed to form buds, that sort of long stem broccoli-like looking thing is what actually would have been grown there, a genuine vegetable looking thing. Next slide. And here, Rupert, you could actually go really quite quickly. So this is dune spinach, which grows extensively along our coastline. And as the years have gone by, I've discovered that it even grows right up into the wild coast where I visited recently. And it's one of my personal favorites. I make all sorts of things with it, from falafels to stir fries to just salads, putting it in an omelette. You can give me the next slide. Then one of the other vegetables that also grows on our coastline, but is a little bit more threatened, is sea pumpkin. And its natural it naturally occurs kind of between Horston and Stilby, that sort of zone. And it's threatened not because it's a delicate little plant, but because its habitat is threatened by expansion, housing expansion. So, and it grows incredibly easily. It's one of those which we have actually started growing. Next slide. And on the sea like this, literally at the high water mark, it's nice and sour and juicy. Where we've started growing it at the SI in Renosterveld, it loses that lovely lemony juiciness, which was quite an interesting thing to discover. And it's you can cook it, but I just think it's fantastic raw, and it propagates so easily. To me, this is one of our real winners. Next slide. Then this plant is a very interesting one, and this is one which crosses over a number of biomes. So I'm speaking both about Braxlei and Soetslei, Braxlei being Mesembryanthum guericianum, Soetslei being crystallinum. And the top left image is one many of us have walked there and never realized we were walking past food. Top right is a Braxlei patch down the road from Wolfgat. And that entire carpet is Braxlei. And the seeds are absolutely delicious to use as well. Next slide. I mean, they grow in the Karoo as well. So the left-hand image is, that left-hand image is a very interesting one because this is a crossover a rainfall region. And in the patch there, I saw all the different growth stages of the ice plant, which to me was an indicator that we're going to be able to cultivate this plant very easily because it's responding to rainfall. So if it's in a summer rainfall area, it's going to germinate when the water comes. If it's in a winter rainfall area, it's going to germinate when the water comes. So that to me was like a real indicator of its willingness to become a crop. And it's just, I've yet to meet anybody who doesn't like it. Next slide. I mean, it is just the juiciest, most divine thing that you could ever use. Then here are two forms of Braxlei. The bottom one and the right-hand one are Braxlei growing on the West Coast. Both of these are actually in the West Coast National Park. The top left one, you can see the soil is different, and that is a Braxlei which is right up in the Northern Cape, in completely different kind of soil, totally growing in summer rainfall, and successfully being cultivated on a farm up there. They tend to have more square stems. That's one of the ways in which you can tell the difference. On the West Coast, the Braxlei tends not to have those sort of typical ice planty little sort of cells of water, bladders, which are the sort of telltale sign that the plant is retaining water quite actively. Next slide. And I mean, I think that these are actually excellent plants to use in landscaping as well, because they really are very, very beautiful. And they are totally, totally delicious to work with. So I've used them in salsas, in salads, in tsatsikis. You can give me the next slide. And you can see how different those leaves look. Then this is here again, that self-same sunquill that I showed you on the Khayelitsha farm. And this is near Horston, where some clearing of aliens was happening. And the sunquill behaved like a pioneer, and it came up as if it was a planted farm bed. I mean, it was just phenomenal to see how, and that was again another sort of telltale sign that this is a plant which could actually be grown en masse for selling in a supermarket. So it's one of the plants that I have been working with quite a lot. You can give the next slide. Veldkool is a much more gentle growing plant. So here I've got 3 of the Trachyandras. Top left is sunquill, which is the one that looks a bit like long stem broccoli. The middle one is falcata, which is namakwa. And that one you'll find on the West Coast, but you'll also find it much further north. It's sort of into Namakwa land. And then the right-hand one is Veldkool, the floppy one, which we find on our pavements all over town. And it is in all 3 of those, to my mind, are vegetables that I would love to see in our supermarkets, not to mention actually that we have them in our coastal gardens and actually use them for our own use. Next slide. So here's some suncoil, which was roasted. You can keep going. You don't have to reverse loop it. Bottom left, there is some veldkool that was pickled. He's speeding me up here. Then we're getting onto the aromatic herbs and teas. And, this is what we think of as fynbos. We think of an aromatic landscape. And you can give me the next slide. I mean, there are such a variety of them that I think we could be exploring far more extensively for culinary tea use. They're quite extensively still used for medicinal tea use, but I think that they could actually be used far more in beverages, in teas. They're beginning to be used in alcohols. You can give me the next slide. And I've done a little bit of playing with them as well, where I've done some infusing. I mean, here there's a sort of crossover with garden plants, where many of the pelargoniums, which we like to use in our gardens, are also fantastic to use in cordials and in infusions. You can give the next plant. I'm in the next slide. And then here we have wild rosemary, which is another plant which, as landscapers and as ordinary gardeners, we are familiar with, and which you can buy at the nursery. But it's fantastic to use in cooking, and you can use it in very much the same way as you would use conventional rosemary. Next slide. And it also makes, it clips extremely well. So it can be used in a tidy way. The top left is in Babylon's Turin. And it's a pretty showy plant. It makes fantastic crackers. So never mind Woolworths using foreign rosemary. We should really be using our own rosemary far more extensively than we do. Next slide. Marijke made mention of the salvias, and there are several salvias that are very nice to use in a culinary way. In the bottom slide there, I was making a burnt butter. So you can use recipes in much the same way as we might be using sort of European herbs, but actually substituting our own local herbs into them. And they're an easy thing to include in your garden. The top right slide, I combined suncoil with the sage, and it made a pretty good. And then that zata at the bottom left there was actually served at Fynbos Forum this past year, and it was a total hit with everybody. Next slide. And then this is one of those that I'm really hoping to get into cultivation. And it's another one which actually I found growing on the Wild Coast again. So interestingly, I initially thought of it very much as a winter rainfall plant, but in fact, it's actually growing in the summer rainfall area as well. And it is another one of those which will be easy for us to take on in our cooking habits because it looks so familiar. It looks like a parsley and it tastes very much like a celery. Next plant. And the seeds are incredibly exciting to, next slide, not plant, exciting to make use of as well. Quercus uses them as lot. They've got that very typically Apiaceae inflorescence, and I've used them in pickling. I could describe a lot of different things that you can use with it. Next slide. So this guy I'm not going to spend too much time on because this really is actually a summer rainfall plant. Our local Tilbachia capensis doesn't grow as vigorously as this. It's greatly in demand for medicinal use, but this is such a common garden plant that it's worth mentioning because so many people have it in their gardens and actually don't make use of it in a culinary way. And there's just use less than you would of ordinary garlic because it's pretty pungent, and the flowers are amazing to use as well as is shown in the bottom left hummus. Next slide. Then the berries and the fruits and the seeds are, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide actually. So Lycium ferrocyssimum, which is the middle slide, is in the slide where it says Boere mag nie pomp nie. That was the bush on which these little berries grow. And it's an amazing bush because although it has very delicate soft leaves, so it hasn't got those sort of typical fynbos leaves, which are either leathery or incredibly small and needle-like to deal with hot, dry summers, this one will shed its leaves, its entire crop of leaves, a couple of times a year when there's a hot, dry, windy spell that means that there's going to be too much transpiration that happens. So there's a kind of a resilience in that plant, which is phenomenal. It's a solanaceae. It's one of our wild sort of tomato-y plants, very closely related to the goji berry. Then the top two slides are of the Cercia family, of which I think there are very, very many PhDs waiting to happen and nutrition analysis waiting to happen because we've got about 300 species across the whole country. And I suspect once the analysis is done, they'll get classified as a superfood. And many of them are fantastic to use in landscaping or as windbreaks. So they're a very, very underdeveloped species that could also be wild harvested from. Then the middle right-hand one is the good old skilpad bessie, which is the one which I learned about as a kid, which exists in the archaeological record, and which was one of the first ways in which I learned that our landscapes are edible. And then the bottom left one is, in fact, the fruit which comes off that biodiversity garden dome. Those are the fruits that come off that hedge, and it makes amazing cordial and amazing marmalade. Next slide. So this guy we know very well and hasn't been forgotten. Next slide. And I've done some unusual things with it. I think the bottom right slide, yes, there we go. I've picked them green, sliced them, and then pickled them. And there's an extraordinary fragrance that comes from them. And when they're more like the top right slide, then they are delicious to peel and eat just like that, or to turn into a jam. Next slide. Some of the other berries, so here's a cercia, a few different cercias. Some of them are more scrappy than others, but they are also very willing to be cut quite hard. So they can be kept in trim for use in a garden. Next slide. So here are some of the ways in which I've used them, including, they were in that za'atar, so grinding them up. And they're related to the Mediterranean sumac family. I put them quite often into pickles as well. Next slide. Very, very underrated species, which I'm hoping will really get into much more use. So this is all over again, this darling slung bessie, which I love. And there I did a little triple solanaceae roasting thingy at the bottom there. And I also made them into a romesco kind of a sauce. I think these are exciting fruits. Next one. And then this is my favorite little skilpad bessie, which is one of those where children walking in the veld will still snack on these. They are incredibly juicy, and that inflorescence is stunning. So when you're driving up the N7 going into the Cedarburg, you'll actually see patches of hillside which are purple, and you know, okay, fine. Later in the year, there's going to be skilpad bessies for the picking. So that, I think, is the last next slide of the sort of visuals that I've showed. And a lot of the work that I've done recently has been to encourage cultivation, because a lot of the interest in our local edibles has happened on the back of this foraging trend that is so incredibly strong. But there's no way that we can actually bring our local edibles into our food systems or start using them more if we're going to be foraging for them, because it's just not a sustainable way to access. So from about 2015 or 16, I started exploring cultivation, and then I started with a farm garden in Khayelitsha, and those were some of the plants that I planted. Next slide. A lot of the work that I've also done, okay, here, this is on the Cape Flats, Paddy Farm. This is ice plant that we actually found on the property itself. So that's really super local crop. And I mean, they just are so willing to grow. And then we also tried getting the dune spinach to grow up supports. And as Marijke said, actually, they need mesh to grow upwards. Next plant. And a lot of the work that I've been doing is to start attracting other people in as well. So for a while, I ran a little project where I was bringing growers and chefs together in the hopes of stimulating a short supply chain. It's been difficult to get that going. Next slide. And for a little while, Paddy was being helpful in helping small-scale growers growing organic veggies, but also beginning to grow indigenous veggies to reach market. They have fallen by the wayside with that endeavor, but there are new, smaller agri-hubs which are much more farmer-driven, which are beginning to emerge, and which are going to become the new way in which indigenous cultivated veggies and leaves are going to reach market. So watch this space for those emerging small agri-hubs on the Cape Flats. Abalimi is linked to them, and Harvest of Hope has turned itself into a farmer-driven cooperative, which I think is a very exciting new development. Next slide. So this is another kind of area of work which I think is extremely important and which relates to traditional knowledge systems, and which is a part of the work that I do with indigenous foods, which I really do believe needs a lot of attention and care, because we have the loss of knowledge about our traditional indigenous foods goes hand in hand with cultural erasure and marginalization of that still exists for the majority of people in this country. So when I get involved in projects, for me, it's really important for there to be some community component. And this project, which Rupert actually has also been a part of, has been very much about reigniting an interest in the edibles in a space where the medicinals are still largely in use, but switching on again the interest in indigenous foods, and at community level, inspiring people to really start engaging with foods from the landscapes again. Next slide. Why is it? No, it doesn't want to go.
Loubie, are you still with us?
I'm still with you. Can you hear me? I'm
Okay,
just
cool.
waiting for the next
Your
slide.
sound cut out for 15 seconds.
Okay, fine. I'm waiting. That's why the next slide wasn't happening. So this, okay, well, did you hear where I was talking about the importance of working with community in an erased, marginalized environment that still is so predominant in our country? So projects, that's a very important component in any projects that I work with, to make sure that we're working with people whose traditional knowledge these foods would have belonged to. Next slide. No, this one is such a nice picture, it doesn't want to move. Can you give me the next one, Roops? No, I wonder why. Have you lost me completely? That's a pity. What's going on? Okay, let's see what's happening here.
Sorry, that was me being cut off now.
Okay.
Yeah, let's just continue. Okay, go for it, Loubie.
Okay, so yeah, okay, cool. So the research side of things, so working with community is very important, but also co-creating new knowledge is also equally as important. So this was a project with a Stellenbosch student. Next slide. And I won't say much about what we learned, but it's so much more of this kind of collaborative research needs to happen about these foods that have been completely forgotten. This project, the Local Wild Food Hub, this is where Rirhandzu and I cross over quite a lot. It's a partnership with the Sustainability Institute, and we have a community of practice running there. And the Sustainability Institute have published both my books, and there's an Indigenous food garden that's happening there. And for me, that's an incredibly exciting place to work, because they've got a hospitality division, they've got a sort of research and knowledge creation division, and then they also have the gardens and the food growing. So all those sorts of aspects of our indigenous food can happen on one place, which I think is incredible. Next slide. So this is my most recent book. The first book was The Grower's Guide, which was really pitched at home gardeners and at small scale growers. The Cook's Guide, you can go quite quickly through these next slides. You can literally just flip from one to the next, Rupert. So this is a book which really is talking about some of the background of my engagement with foods. It gives descriptions of all of the plants more from a culinary perspective, whereas the Grower's Guide speaks of them from a cultivation, how they grow and how they occur in the wild perspective. I've also got some pages in this book which gives fairly dense information for people who are prepared to be experimental in their own kitchens, and they don't necessarily need a recipe. It gives some sort of key ideas of how the various 22 ingredients in this book could be used in kitchens. Keep going, you can flip quite quickly. And then the last sort of pages of the book are a variety of recipes using these foods in ways which are familiar to us. So I haven't put in kind of fancy recipes. I've put things in which would encourage people to try them out, because they are things which we know already. You know, making a falafel is not too difficult, or making a tzatziki, but with indigenous things is not too difficult. Next one, I think, just shows an image of the community of practice and gives you a sense of the fact that we really are putting a lot of effort into making sure that it is a very diverse, representative, multi-stakeholder group of people that are working together to bring indigenous foods back into our food systems. Next slide, which I think should be the last one. Yes, there we go. This is how you can reach me. And for anybody who is actually interested in this community of practice, which cuts across traditional knowledge systems, science knowledge systems, farmers, chefs, researchers, it's government bodies, non-profits. It's a really, really mixed group of people. If there's people that are interested in participating in this community of practice, then please do reach out, because it's part of what will actually guide how we responsibly reintegrate our edibles into our food systems from a social point of view and also from an ecological point of view, so that as we work with them and valorize them, that we do so in a way that is appropriate to regeneration of our landscapes and our society.
Thanks, Loubie. I think there was a lot of positivity in the chat. I'm just reminding people that if you do have questions, to put them in the Q&A and not in the chat, because then it's easier for us to track. And thank you for sticking with us. I think we're having a really fruitful time. So I saw Savannah earlier talking about thank you for the shout out to the for the summer rainfall. We're going to expand that a little bit. And Rirhandzu, thank you. Unmute yourself. Do you want to try sharing, or should I go from my side?
Let me try from my side. Can you see my screen?
Not yet, but also just by means of introduction, this is Rirhandzu Marivate, who is also based out of the Sustainability Institute, and she is an agroecologist in her current guise, but also many other things. Rirhandzu, I'm not seeing anything yet.
I'm struggling with sharing. I think you'll have to share from your side.
Okay, let me just put it full screen.
All right.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. I feel quite nervous now after listening to Marijke and Loubie. I think these are veterans in the field. And then so for today, just please take me in as a student, because I'm still learning quite a lot around this. And I think with that, I just wanted to kind of give a brief background of my journey and how I got to this point. I have an ecological degree, and I've worked as environmental management for a while. And I think in that space, worked with quite a lot of communities as well as small scale developments. And I think one of the things realized was that there was quite a lot of need for support in the space of agriculture, and felt that there is quite a lot of erasure in terms of the types of practices we had traditionally, to how a lot of people were wanting to self-realize commercially to be able to access the market. And so felt that there was a need to see how you can, in this umbrella of sustainable agriculture, as well as now a regenerative agriculture, it can use the opportunity of reintegrating traditional and indigenous knowledge in food growing into the system. And yeah, and then so I've kind of shifted from environmental management and that to wanting to actually know how to firstly farm and how the agricultural sector really works, in order to understand then how we can have opportunities of integrating more indigenous and natural practices in terms in food. And then so today, Rupert gave me the opportunity to see how I could just make a case study of more of traditional foods. And like Loubie, I'm really trying to focus on more what I would call African and more, I guess, speaking from my own kind of personal kind of heritage and history, you know, Black heritage foods. And so I'm quite interested in learning more and in really building this knowledge. So you'll see, unlike with Loubie and Marijke, I'm just really going to give a large overview, a broad overview, I mean, in this regard, in terms of the history, in terms of how to move forward around what's commonly referred as either forgotten or orphan crops in South Africa. And so one of the things that I really am going to try or focus on in this presentation is just really kind of ingraining and giving a picture of our food system. And I feel that Loubie has touched a little bit on different aspects on our history in that. And so if I'm repeating, just please just bear in mind. So next slide, Rupert. So I think we're all really aware that in terms of our culture in South Africa, and I just wanted to give this context in case people are not sure, is that it's one of our biggest economic sectors, and it also is the largest land user. And so this means it has had quite a detrimental or transformational impact on our natural landscapes. And so in terms of the types of agriculture that we have in the country, it's still very much large-scale conventional commercial agriculture. And this has firstly had a big impact on land or environmental degradation, as well as quite a lot of biodiversity loss, soil loss, and also impact on our waterways, and also has contributed to greenhouse gas emissions, and so ultimately also contributes to climate change. And on the flip side is that agriculture, in terms of how our agricultural system is, it's also quite vulnerable to the environmental change, and so it's also being impacted by the current, climate change and the way that the environment is changing from, different environmental conditions that we're currently observing. And so with this, next slide, Rupert. So with this, I just wanted to also then touch on a brief history of how we've really gotten here. And Loubie has alluded to the fact that there has been a change since colonization or the colonial period. And then I think just taking a step back, we realize that there's been quite a lot of movement here in the South, like even predating the Dutch or the Portuguese or the English. But then that was still quite very much ingrained in bringing in different ways of our food system. And so this speaks to the fact that I think we've evolved from being hunter-gatherers to being more pastoralists, and then bringing in agricultural practices. But then even with having crop production at the time, yes, the population was smaller, but then the types of crops that we had were born of or were from the African continent. And so this means they were still quite African in terms of the farming and the crops that we actually produced. But then when the Dutch East India Company or the Dutch came in, there was quite a shift and I guess a predisposition in terms of the type of crops that we were actually then starting to be produced. And this is what we could refer to now as the Western diet. And so this meant that there was, through our colonial and apartheid history, we know that there's been quite a lot in trying to bring inequality and really suppress a lot of our culture and traditional knowledge. But then besides that, I think next slide, Rupert. This also created like I mentioned, a Western diet, but then at the same time, the way that apartheid was then also African indigenous crops to more poverty as poverty foods first and foremost. And I think in terms of and I would really maybe one day want to get into this, is that in terms of the way that our society was then created, in terms of having urban migration from a lot of communities of color coming in from rural areas where there was quite a lot of traditional practice, and still a lot of the those indigenous and traditional ways of growing were still intact, then had to move into cities where the access to food was either Western, and a lot of the times also very much highly calorific but nutritiously poor. And then so this has really affected and impacted the way that we engage and we access food. And then even since, post 94, this has really been our diet. And I think continuous urbanization also has an impact on the loss of our indigenous ways, whereas there's still, rural communities and small scale growers that grow traditionally or grow more of the traditional African crops, but that knowledge is being lost because there's this rapid urbanization, and we've just been so well placed in this more Western society. Okay, next slide. And then so with that, just really wanted to touch on the fact that yes, although we have quite a Western food palette and a food system, we still have quite a diversity in terms of a lot of our indigenous crops. And then so with that, I was just reading a study and a paper that was written by Dr. Ethel Perry, and she really champions quite a lot of the work around underutilized and off-end crops, particularly in the summer rainfall areas in South Africa, and I think in slightly other southern parts of Africa. And so what we find is that, I think in the slide, I just wanted to highlight the 5 categories that they're wanting to really explore in terms of building more of the research. So I think a lot of research has been done with different crops, particularly around like the nutritional value and like knowing that they also have better resiliency, as well as they have more genetic diversity. And so in terms of looking at an adaptive future, they're actually better placed in terms of having better place in terms of building a more resilient food or agricultural system, and as well as helping with restoring our natural environmental landscape, so to speak. And then so in this picture, so there's 5 main categories really of the types of indigenous plants that are being focused on. And then so the first being, I think I'll start with the amaranth, which is that purple one on the top left. And it's referred to as a leafy vegetable. And then so a lot of times they do use the leaves, or we do use the leaves to cook that, but then I think you can also use the seeds as well. The next one, I will take the one to the right, top right, and that's finger millet as well. And I'll speak a little bit more on millet in a little bit. And then that's referred to as a grain, and that's under the category of grain. So instead of, for example, wheat as a grain, finger millet and different types of millets would be like a really great alternative. In the middle, bottom middle, that's amadumbe or yam. And I know this one is grown quite a lot in the KZN region of the country. And then this would be part of the category of roots. I mean, there's other roots as well in this category. And yeah, so this would also be like a great replacement for your, like, you know, for things like sweet potato and and things like that. And then on your bottom left, that is, and I only learned recently the English term for this, and I always tell people that it's bambara nuts. Growing up, I've grown up eating quite a lot of this. And my mother's Tswana, and then so just with that, we've grown up eating and growing quite a lot of the bambara nuts. I always refer to them as diplo. And then these are legumes, and then there's also quite a big category of different types of legumes that also can be a great kind of replacement to things like, you know, your typical beans and things like that. And then the last one, which I found interesting, and I think this also speaks to more of the kind of undercultivated and more like wild harvested, would be the one that is on the bottom right, and that's murula. And murula then is a representation of more of the fruits that we find. So things like a baobab, murula, monkey orange would be ones that are not necessarily as cultivated, but then they still used prolifically through wild harvesting. And I know there's quite a big industry, and I think, yeah, there's more sustainable harvesting practices in terms of making sure, like, you know, having good regulation to be able to regulate that. And then the focus is really to see how then within these different categories we can try and build more understanding and knowledge. And I'll speak more a little bit later in the slides of then how do we like encourage and firstly reclaim our heritage, and then popularize indigenous foods so that they actually then become more common, not only for our rural and small scale communities, but then as well as more of like our urban and retail spaces. Please move to the next slide. Oh yeah, and then I just wanted to kind of insert myself and my family here. And then so one of the things that we're realizing quite a lot in terms of how traditional and indigenous foods is still kept, even though that those practices and access to that food is dying down, is that there's still quite a lot of rural communities and like I mentioned, small scale farmers that still grow. And then so this is a case in point with my own family. So the picture on the left, no, let me actually start with the picture on the right. Yeah, so that's my friend. So we have a family farm back home in the Northwest. And then so we still use quite a lot of the traditional practices, and one of them is the 3-system method. And so we were busy during COVID 2020 December planting mealies, and then incorporating more of the bambara nuts as well as cowpeas, so that it helps with really building the soil, and then also having a symbiotic relationship in terms of the way that the plants help one another. And then on the left, this was actually last weekend. So those are my 2 baby nieces, and then that's my mother and their grandmother. So they had harvested bambara nuts, and then so they left them out to dry. And then so my nieces were helping my mother kind of package and take them home, and then we traditionally just boil them and then eat them as they are, or you can actually mix them into in samp. And the pot in the middle, those are the cowpeas mixed in with the mealies that we grow, and then would make what in the Eastern Cape or here in the Western Cape was called moshu, but then samp traditionally. And then so I just wanted to highlight how even though a lot of the times traditional foods seem currently foreign for some people, with a lot of communities, and particularly in Black communities, that's still quite a lived experience and part of their diet, but it's not necessarily seen or reflected within retail spaces. You can move on to the next slide. And then, yeah, so I just wanted to have myself in the picture as well, and then just highlighting just other crops. And it also, I found out last week what that plant in the middle was in English. And I think, yeah, just speaking of knowing English names, is that a lot of the times we only know a lot of our traditional foods in our own vernac or indigenous languages. So it's always very hard to then try and find the food, or because, for example, I was trying to look for different recipes for this. It's called an African gourd. It's similar to like bitter gourd or bitter melon. That's more in East Asia, but this one's not bitter. And then we call it leraka kaswana. And then so we also grow that. And then also, I mean, I'm holding a watermelon, and watermelon is more commercial and quite popular. And that, I mean, like, that's also one of the more traditional African, I mean, that's an African indigenous plant. And then so there's also quite a lot of practices of trying to grow a lot of goats, what do you call pumpkins, and crops like that, as well as part of more of the rural lifestyle, so to speak. And yeah, and then with that, move on to the next slide. So one of the big challenges is that, as I mentioned, is although there is still some knowledge in indigenous traditional plants, that knowledge is actually declining, and that also means that a lot of the food is also declining into in our diets. And then so, I mean, one of besides urbanization and also that disposition of our food system, it also speaks to the fact that there actually isn't a big market for that. And then in terms of how agriculture currently is structured, it doesn't also allow for there to be opportunity to bring in a lot of the more traditional indigenous foods into more of the commercial market. And I mean, it's quite besides there being popularity and interest in the crop itself, it's also just making sure, for example, bringing sorghum in at a market or competitive advantage means that also speaking to having subsidies and then also having like government incentives to really help with growing more indigenous plants. And then so what's happened is that this year is known by the Food and Agricultural Organization as the Year of the Millet. And so this is to really kind of reignite and re-engage particularly people on the African continent around millet, and also as a representative kind of crop or category for representing more of the African traditional foods. And with that, next slide. Sorghum being, I think, one of the biggest millets out there, that's, I think, well known, and it's also called the Great Millet, has been seen to be a really great representation of where African traditional foods are currently. I mean, everyone should know sorghum because we have it in so many different spaces, from Mkombote traditional beer. We even have it in Matabella, and or we have it as Ding and Omacheu. But then what's interesting is that sorghum in the past 20 odd years, the sales and the market demand for it have been declining. And then, as I mentioned previously, it's just because it doesn't have a competitive advantage to other grains. And I think it's also because there hasn't really been, quite a lot of visibility and interest from the general population to have sorghum as an alternative grain or crop. And then so a lot of work has been done, not only by the FAO, but then also, I think this year, there's been quite a lot of opportunities in terms of research, in terms of also highlighting a number of small scale growers to alluding to actually kind of trying to get sorghum back out and more marketable. And then so sorghum, like most of the indigenous traditional crops that we have, has been proven to actually have quite a lot of benefits. It's nutritionally, it's more environmentally resilient, and I think it's going to be great in terms of climate adaptation. And then, like many of the other indigenous crops, as I mentioned, there's also quite a lot of diversity within the crop, and particularly genetic diversity. And one of the things that connects conservation to sorghum, I think, there's two main things. The first is the plant conservation strategy of that highlights, I think it's target 9, that speaks to the conservation and preservation of plant genetic diversity in a way that also honors indigenous and local knowledge of crops. And then secondly, under the climate change bill, there is the strategic framework for implementation of the ecosystem-based adaptation strategic framework that really speaks to looking at beneficiating more of indigenous crops in a way that also speaks to biodiversity conservation as well. And then so I think what is left is that there also needs to be on the other end where we actually then create a market for these crops to be able to thrive, so that we can actually have a sustained and growing future in indigenous traditional crops. Yeah, last slide. I think it's the last slide. And then so, yeah, through this whole presentation, what I've learned is that we just really need to reclaim and popularize our traditional pellets, create and sustain commercial market opportunities for our traditional indigenous foods. And through these things, increasing biodiversity and building resilience, not only in our farming practices, but then just generally in our environment. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Rirhandzu. Sure. I think that's a lot of food for thought from everyone. We're running a bit on, but I think, is there any burning question from the panelists to each other? And then, excuse me, there are 2 questions in the Q&A, one for Marijke and one for Rirhandzu. And then we see how it goes. Yeah, Marijke, can you answer us that one question there? I don't know if you're still online. Whether Greenpoint Garden is still self-sustainable, or if you're still thinking. Rirhandzu, can you go on to that next one, which asks, what efforts have there been from the government or other partners to provide more of a competitive advantage to indigenous plants like sorghum? Yeah, I think I'll put it Rirhandzu.
That's a really good question. I don't know quite a lot in this space. I think I know that particularly from like from the Department of the FFE, I forgot what it stands for now. There's actually quite a lot of effort to try and promote indigenous plants and all of that. And I think within a Department of Agriculture, there's not necessarily been work that's been done to focus on particularly bringing in indigenous crops to market. But there's been effort in firstly trying to bring in the lens of agroecology and traditional farming growing practices in that. And then so I think with the work that's being done this year under the umbrella of Year of the Millet, the different stakeholders that are also trying to engage with government to try and engage and then see how we can actually build those market advantages. And I'm not sure how long that's going to take, but it's hopeful that the discussion and the dialogues are happening.
Cool, thank you. I've just received notification that I also need to leave quite soon. So I want to, before we sign off, just thank all three presenters, Marijke, Rirhandzu, and Loubie for this. It looks like we need to do a follow-up because there's just so much kind of territory that we have to cover. I need to share one more thing before the end, which is, remember next weekend is the City Nature Challenge. I know it's a long weekend, but if you check the link that we've shared, there's definitely many ways of contributing towards iNaturalist wherever you are. And keep an eye on Crew's social media and also the BotSoc social media. There'll be a lot of sharing to say where people are active. And then also, just as an answer to Dai, who asked that question about whether Greenpoint Park Garden is self-sustainable, Marijke's busy answering it. So it is maintained by the City of Cape Town. And I see she's still typing. So, there we go. And then she says, with the security and ongoing repairs to play equipment and irrigation costs quite a bit to maintain. Please elucidate what you mean by sustainable. So I think on that unrequited note, we're going to end off, and just remember also to follow the Loubie and Marijke and also Rirhandzu on Instagram. You can find them pretty easily. And also Loubie and Marijke's books are available and very useful to have if you're interested in indigenous plants in any way. And thank you, everyone. Just be safe. I'm looking to surprise you with the next webinar topic, so watch this space, and it'll be on the 25th of May. So take care. If you're driving, watch out, especially on the long weekend next week. Just be careful and enjoy our plants wherever you are. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you, Rusch.